What are we looking at here? Wow, this beautiful obelisk. Give us
This
some
is
details.
yeah, this is where you actually arrive. You know, when you enter the region, this is the obelisk. You travel by the means of the obelisk, and right now you're sort of like at the center of the region. Almost, I think in every region, the obelisk is the center of the region, and this is where you start your journey, basically.
This appears to be the wettest and swampiest of all of the regions by far.
Yes, by
And
far.
this is breathtaking Traveler's Gorge. Tell us about this.
Yeah, so because obelisks are eventually connected with one another, the location of the Abyssal Basin is made it so that a lot of the paths leading towards Abyssal Basin sort of are combining when they arrive at the obelisk, and it made it so that this area has become sort of cut down through the forest because the energy obelisk and the people traveling sort of cut a tunnel through it, basically, and that's what we're looking at right now.
I love the scale too. You can see the ranger there in the center of the frame, that tiny little dot there with Mozart. It's just nuts to see the scale on these spaces, how breathtaking it is. And then here is an entirely different looking swamp area. I love this name, Titanicus Mushrooms. Whoever came up
Yes.
with that name deserves a raise. Tell us about these giant mushrooms.
Well, basically, the idea is that this I think is to the southwest, or at least to the west part of the region. It's way more swampy, so there, as you can see, there's way less trees. And the Titanicus mushrooms is a type of mushroom that sort of grows underground. They're absolutely enormous. I think maybe there's an Arlen in the picture, because usually I push people to put a human for skill in there. They may not be there, but they grow underground, and as they keep growing and growing, at some point they sort of start to raise up, and basically everything that is above them, they just lift into the air. And that's how like a whole new playing field opens itself up, because you can now not only explore below the mushrooms, but also on top of
Right, the traversal mechanics in the overworld to be able to double, triple jump up there, etc., to get to the top of these mushrooms. And I
it.
really love
Exactly.
the Illuvium kind of colored, let's call it bioluminescence. I don't know if that's
Yes.
accurate underneath the
Yep.
mushrooms there. That's
Yeah.
really beautiful. So typically under a mushroom is interesting. It looks like almost like an accordion, but this is like a bioluminescent cyber fantasy accordion almost. It looks nuts. I love the design there. And this one does have a person for scale in the
Yep.
swamp, as you can see right over here. Just letting everybody know the scale of these giant mushrooms.
Yeah, and if you can see in the top right, there's actually something bigger growing there too, but it's a bit fake. But this was a piece that's used to sort of get a good idea of what the asset would look like in the environment. This is yeah. This eventually, I think, right now in the level itself, these are all modeled and textured, and they have the light coming from below. They populate a large area of the forest. They're pretty cool.
That is really cool. I'm just curious to know, with something like Titanicus mushrooms, does somebody just come up in a meeting like, I want to make some giant mushrooms? Or does somebody just go straight to drawing it? Or how do you come up with an idea like that for an area like this? I'm just curious.
Yeah. Okay. So basically, most of the time there's an idea, uh, like a small text probably put in there by Aaron, and then from that text I start to concept out and ideate like what the region is gonna look like, or what's gonna feature, and then it's sort of like an ideation process between me and Grant and Aaron, sometimes Ben and Mark or whatever, and then everybody sort of like comes together and has these inputs and ideas of how we actually build it. But usually all the way at the beginning, where the concept art department does its work, I usually write out these region descriptions, and then I get my team to sort of take parts of that description and sort of visualize it, and then I usually help a little bit with some sketches or some references, and or I do a piece of myself to sort of help them on their way.
Awesome. So it's a very fluid, creative process between multiple parties, both on the
Oh
game
yeah,
design side and in your on and within the concept art area.
definitely. Yeah, like this whole game is basically just a collaboration of 200 artists, right? It's just everybody works together, everybody has their own ideas and inputs and their specialty on how you actually make it beautiful. And
Fair enough.
eventually everybody's got to do their part, and then if they do, you end up with something very cool.
You just called me an artist, so I'm cool with that.
Sure.
Here's another
Hey,
look at the
it's an art at doing this, right? So
exactly. Here's another look at the mushrooms, kind of from another angle and in a slightly different style, which is really, really
yeah.
cool to see those different styles. And then Here's what's really cool about Abyssal Basin. Totally different look now. Obviously, it's
Yes.
still wet and swampy-ish, but it's now going from this very swampy, mushroomy type of environment to something very different. What are we looking at here?
Yeah, basically a wetland, right? This is Bluewood, which is yeah, like I say, a wetland, and there's like all of these waterfalls coming down from the edge of the basin. With if you look all the way back in the picture, you see like this giant tree, sort of like creating those waterfalls. And in the level, if you would be playing, you would actually see like the whole cliff face just littered with all these gigantic trees. I think Bluewood well trees is what they call, and they sort of have a massive root system underneath that pump up water from the ground or ocean or whatever, and they actually take the nutrients from the water and they spew it out again from the top.
Very cool. Man, it's so amazing looking. And the thing is, we need variety in these spaces that we're engaging with in Illuvium. As people are grinding, they're collecting resources and what have you. We need that visual variety. And this is the same area, but now with significant visual variety. So what happened here that made
Well,
Bluewood turn blue into green?
yeah, so then it becomes greenwood at night. Actually, the radiation sort of from the Earth or from the planet that they pump up influences the bioluminescence in the water, and then eventually, when sunlight disappears, it starts to glow and turns bluewood into greenwood.
Love it. Very cool. And then here's an entirely different part of Abyssal Basin, looking like some remains of a Leviathan. Tell us about this.
Yes. So between Bluewood, which is an area, there's like kind of like a lake or a stream, basically a big river that you have to cross to make it into the Abyssal Grove. And because it's so deep and muddy, and I guess at some point Leviathans were there and they got stuck and they couldn't move and they died, and basically the remains remained in that area, and now nature is sort of taken over and they're growing stuff over there. And I think in the next slide you will see yeah, you will see sort of like the enormity of the river and of the skeletons that still remain there, and how
And this
you
is
can
the bridge.
actually
Mm.
yeah, this is the bridging
A
between
bridge.
Bluewood and Greenwood.
Very cool. I love how, as we're going through this art, you guys have thought of not only each individual area, but the transitions, the entrances, and the exits to each area. So visually, it can walk gamers through, just really kind of, it doesn't have to necessarily be linear, but it almost kind of like leads you into the next area, I've
Yes.
noticed, with
Yep.
these very deliberate transitions between areas. Can you talk a little bit about the thinking behind that? We're going to see a lot more of that in the other regions as well.
Yeah, so because like everything that you're seeing right now is basically taking place underneath the safe dome of the obelisk, right? And this is sort of like the area that we have to work with, and we know that players will be there, and we know that it has to be a certain size, but we also want to make it so it's a nice flow for people to walk through the regions, so they don't have to travel one direction, travel back, travel the other direction, travel back, because that becomes very annoying. Especially, we expect people to want to go out there and grind and get the Illuvials that they want, but if they didn't find the ones that they did, they'll have to go back. And then we, because they're going to be in the region so many times, we don't want them to get this annoyance when they're exploring the region. So there has to be thought out how people are going to play through the region, and that's also influencing the design basically, but not so much the lore. Not so much lore. We make sure that we have enough cool ideas that we can somehow implement while not sacrificing the gameplay mechanics, basically.
That makes sense. And this is wild. Even more variety in Abyssal Basin here with last
Yes.
ripples. With these, they look mushroom flower-esque. Tell us about this root system here.
Yeah, so this is basically the bridge or the border of coming from out of last ripples into the Abyssal Grove. And the Abyssal Grove is like the largest part of Abyssal Basin, which is like a mangrove forest with a lot of roots and gigantic trees and mushrooms and flowers. And because it's so dense, there's barely any light coming through. So all the plants and flowers that grow in there have found a way to sort of self-illuminate, and that's
Of course
sort of
they have, and it makes them glow and look gorgeous, which is
it's a
great
bit
for.
avatarish, so.
Yeah, exactly. And then here's a mangrove-like forest, still in the same region, guys.
Yeah, because it's so large, it actually there's a whole bunch of separate themes almost to certain parts of the region, and certain unique assets that only grow or can be found in one part, etc. And as you travel through it, you're going to be traveling through all of these different themes, basically.
Very cool. And abyssal pumpkins is probably my favorite aspect of this region. Tell me about abyssal pumpkins. Are these evil pumpkins?
Yes.
Are they edible? Tell me a little bit more about them.
Okay, so the idea is that they there's like a chicken and egg story here, because if they grow and they start glowing, as you see in the image, that means that it's almost ripe, and it will eventually pop and it will fall down into the abyssal grove water, where it will start to sort of shed off its light, and then it will start over again. And then underneath the water, you will also find these sort of like pumpkins laying around that are still glowing or dimming. And then as they sort of stop glowing, they start to rebirth, basically, and they will not show any light, and they will start to again feed on the nutrients and gases, whatever that's in the water, and they start to build up this energy again, and they will sort of move out of the water until eventually they pop and they fall back into the water.
Love it. The circle of life. Very like it's like
Yes.
teeming with life. Very, very cool. And then here's an example of what I was talking about earlier of a very deliberate entrance to an area that kind of leads you in with that sliver of light here. Tell us about this.
This is the Keldricks Belt, which is also like a bit of a homage to Kendrick, who's one of our concept artists who did this work. This is a gigantic Bluewood well tree that's really out of place. It's like in the middle of the forest. It's the only one there, and it's absolutely enormous, and it sticks out over all of the Abyssal Grove. So even if you were at the Obelisk, you would sort of see it all the way at the back, sticking out of the forest. Which is making it unique, because we don't really know why it's there. The only thing we do know is that there's sort of flooded root system underneath with a sort of sinkhole that's dragging in water. So a lot of things go into that or float off into that entrance and gone. And it's hollow, so you can sort of climb up in there. It's a pretty special place.
Definitely an area for exploration and discovery.
Probably
And
some cool
building that
stuff.
into the design makes a lot of sense. And then here's where everything ends at the sea in the north. So tell us
Yes.
about this.
Yeah, this is basically if you want to go a day to the beach, I guess. This is at the north. You have this root system that sort of lands in beach and in deeper sea. You see the stormy clouds outside at the horizon. Yeah, it's sort of like the how do you say that? Like a dam also for the seawater.
Mhm.
Just like on Earth, we have these mangrove trees or mangrove forests that function as a sort of dam
A
when floods
barrier.
come in.
Yeah,
A barrier.
it's a
Yeah,
barrier to keep the sea from destroying, different
exactly.
aspects of the land and eroding it. That's cool.
Yes.
Mangrove barrier there. That's great. Personally, I'm not going to the beach anywhere in Illuvium because I feel like every region is like designed to kill you somehow. But anyway,
Yeah,
sure.
pretty much.